And now more than ever, I do believe the timeliness of a study in eschatology is very, very obvious. In fact, tonight with the presidential election, last Saturday morning, we have a small group here, probably 12 to 15 people. And I came from my studies last week, I became very, very convinced because of my belief that we have quite likely entered the 70th week, which we'll be discussing tonight. So I hope you don't tune out because I sound like a wacko. But I feel we have quite likely entered the 70th week. And if we have, and then if I flip over to Ezekiel chapter 38, and I take a look at what's going on in there, and I've been studying these things like pretty full bore for, I don't know, 11 years, real hard. Actually, it goes back to the early 80s. I became a premillennialist way back in the early 80s in a very amillennial church. And that didn't make me overly popular. But in Ezekiel chapter 38, using my little cursor thing here, and verse 11 in particular, I was focused a lot last week on this verse. And it says in Ezekiel 38:11, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will fall upon the quiet people who dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls and having no bars or gates. And I've kind of highlighted several places in chapter 38 where it talks about dwelling securely. So, for example, back in verse 8, in verse 10, we have thoughts coming into Antichrist, I believe's mind, Gog, getting set up for the invasion. And then in verse 11, his plan falls into place. But Israel dwelling securely really struck me hard, that how does that happen? On that day in verse 14, when my people Israel are dwelling securely, will you not know it? So the Gog invasion is going to be triggered by Israel dwelling securely and looking like sitting ducks. And I began to think about, well, okay, here we are. We had Gaza in 2023, October 7. Israel had a massive wake-up call, readjustment, has miraculously pushed back against evil on both borders, on the southern border with Hamas and the northern border with Hezbollah, dealing with like 7 fronts right now. Iran kind of orchestrating it all and financing it all. Actually, America financing a lot of it with our money. And so I began to look at that, and I'm asking myself the question, what must actually happen in order for them to be dwelling securely? And we are going to be discussing the possibility that we have entered the 70th week based on a study in Daniel 9:27.
Even First Chronicles 12, I want to say 32, it talks about the sons of Issachar had understanding of their times and how to guide Israel, and our prayer to understand the times that we're in, as well as the same sort of thing talked about in Daniel chapter 12, when not will we shine like stars and leading people to the Lord, but that we would also have that understanding as we go to and fro through the scriptures, as knowledge increases. We get to the end time as the books become open and we start to see what they really were talking about.
You know, and my contention is that obviously God put prophecy for a reason. I think some people argue a fourth of the Bible is prophetic. Jesus claimed to be the spirit of prophecy. And as I look at world events right now, understanding and discerning the times can be like the sons of Issachar, a guide for our actions. And so I was looking at that presidential race, and I'm just going to put the premise out if I'm correct. And I think some of us are on that page. And I don't know for sure, what everybody's position is, but I think there's a high likelihood we've entered the 70th week, and we'll try to unpack that. And this will probably, our study and our discussion will probably be over a few weeks. But given that, and then that would mean, in my mind, and I know there's a lot of controversy over Ezekiel 38, and it's another area where I believe correct discernment on what this passage is saying on the timing issues in particular can really help guide us. And I know there are many in the prophecy community that believe that the Ezekiel 38 invasion will occur before the 70th week of Daniel, and that God intends to use that to bring a Russian invasion into the Middle East, teaming with Islam, going after Israel, and then God supernaturally intervening and destroying them in incredibly miraculous ways. And so that has been the premise of a lot of thinking of good people. And, I believe we stand on the shoulders of those people. But as time has gone on, I do believe there's been some better understandings of these passages. And Joel Richardson, in his book, The Islamic Antichrist and Mideast Beast, and his website at FAI are incredibly helpful. So check those out, and we'll be putting some links in here. But I'm not going to go into an in-depth argument on Ezekiel 38 and the timing. I'm just going to say where I'm kind of at right now. I will go up against the land of unwalled villages on the quiet people who dwell securely. I believe that is about the midpoint. And so now, looking at where we are now, if I'm correct, in 3.5 years, they should be dwelling securely. Well, then I look at our presidential race and I look at the dynamics of Israel, and I try to stay very in tune with some excellent commentaries and people that I trust. Israel, after getting hit by Hamas, all across the board, they're very united. They will not divide the land. Rightly so. I would say don't ever divide the land. You're going to be violating the Abrahamic covenant. He gave you a chunk of land. It's yours. Don't divide it further. And so I would, if they ask my advice, that's what I would tell them. But we know they're going to be set up. The timing issue is up for grabs, but I do believe somewhere close to the midpoint, there's going to be some movement in the Middle East, and Antichrist will take his forces in to a very unguarded folks who believe they're dwelling securely when they're not. So then as I even look at the presidential race, I'm saying which president could allow that to happen, and which president can allow a covenant to be made this year that would even open the door for dividing the land. And I think the obvious answer to that is, who would Israel trust at this point in time? And Donald Trump, with already under his belt the Abraham Accords, is the natural choice to answer that question if my timing is correct. And so there's my kind of opening introduction. We'll dive into that question just kind of a little bit. And right now on Tuesday Eve, as we're talking, it looks, I think the New York Times said it's an 88% chance that Donald Trump is going to be the next president, which I'm very excited about. I know he's not perfect. We all have flaws, but I'm excited that he's in there. He'll push back against darkness and unrighteousness far better than the other side, who, in my mind, have kind of lost their minds. But that's my kind of scenario. And I was presenting that on Saturday morning. I had kind of a mixed response. And it looks like now maybe perhaps my discernment was correct. So if any of the rest of you guys want to jump in to the conversation, that's the door.
I would like to jump in just because I've been following the election tonight as the results come in. And as we're doing this, they are coming in. And currently, Donald Trump is leading Harris 230 to 205 for the electoral vote count. They just called Virginia for Harris while you were talking there, Dave. But as it stands right now, there are, looks like all of the major swing states, there are 5 still in play, and they're all trending for Trump: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona. And currently, in addition to those, there's 2 states that we obviously haven't done Alaska and Hawaii or Nevada yet. But there's 3 additional states that are trending for Harris that haven't been called yet. I'm tending to agree with you, Dave. I know also on the Republican side, it's looks like the GOP just got their 50th Senate seat. So That can be enough for a majority. They get one more and it's over there. And then on the House side, they're currently leading 170 to 123. Still lots more to be decided there. But my mind also does go back to what happened in 2020, where this is actually, to me anyway, it looks like this is still looking very similarly to what was happening at this time before things started to get a little weird in the evening of election night 4 years ago. So you might be right, Dave, but I'm still kind of just like cautiously, optimistic here, right? So
yeah, massive potential for twists and turns, and we'll be talking about that. I mean, I'm excited for Trump to get in, but there's a dark side out there as well that we know is awaiting. And if we are entering into the 70th week, deceit is the major theme of the first year, and we're going to be entering into a storm. So whoever's president, if I'm correct on this, and feel free to disagree or whatever position you want to take, whoever gets in there is going to have a nightmare to deal with. Rick, do you want to comment?
Well, one thought that came to my mind is, regardless of your tribulation eschatology, whether you're pre, mid, post, or pre-wrath, as most of us are, we all would believe that we're experiencing the birth pangs at this time. Those of us that think that the 70th week may have begun, we would be in the first seal, and that would be birth pangs to us from a pre-wrath perspective. But even if you're a pre-trib, they tend to see, as I was pre-trib for a long time, you saw birth pangs as something that would come before the trib was going to be taken out. So we can agree on some of the things. And I think this is going to be a turbulent time where I agree, Dave. I think Trump's going to win this thing. I think it's I can just see it unfolding. And in prophecy, I think we're going to have the best of times and the worst of times all at the same time in the next few years. And people will be saying, peace and security. This is great. Israel will be saying that. But what will be building beneath this system of the Antichrist will be emerging, while people, I think, they're not going to have their eye on the ball. They're going to have their eye on what they want their eye on. And we're going to wake up one day. And we're already seeing a lot of the things going on in our culture, too, where there's more of a surveillance society. I just went into the bank the other day, yesterday, to make a deposit. One of my employees that's part-time, high school girl, had a couple $100 check. She said, "Can I cash that check and put it and just take the cash?" Sure, I cashed it for her right out of the till. I put it in her deposit, and the bank said, "Oh, you can't do that anymore. You're not a financial institution, and so you can't cash checks for people. They have to bring them here." So I can't cash my own check out of my own account for my own employee. Well, technically, no. In Oregon, you have to have a special license to be able to do that. And you could do the paperwork. We're getting into where they want to know where everything's going, where everything's coming from, what you're spending your money on. And I just see a real convergence of so many things. And I think this Donald Trump election is not going to be a divergence from that, but rather part of that puzzle, part of that coming together.
Yes, and they're not actually coming up with these things too, like on their own, like what you're referring to. There's other countries in the West, or at least English speaking, that have been they're already even further down the line than that. I hear stories out of Australia all the time about how they have to tell people what they're going to use the cash for, and just limits on what they're going to do. And anyway, I just find that very interesting. Like the central bank there's some rule that they were trying to pass about how you can't say anything bad about the central bank in Australia. I'm like, why do they need a law like that? So,
yeah, crazy. But I'm going to kind of come back to the passage right in front of us and the PowerPoint, unless Rick or Daniel have any more comments on Ezekiel 38. It really struck me that it has to be Donald Trump. When I if we are entering into it, which I think we are, then Donald Trump has to be the president. There is, and obviously there's twists and turns and things you can't really understand, but it really does have to be him. And so, jumping back into the discussion on are we in the 70th week, and the primary scripture here that we're looking at is Daniel 9:27, and he will strengthen a covenant with the many for 1 week. And I must say, we've been examining this scripture for like a couple of years. We are really not leaving anything unturned. And here is one assumption. And I think one of the lessons I'm learning in this thing is that we make assumptions, we paint a picture in our mind, and then we assume it to be very, very accurate. And this is one, the Antichrist makes the covenant. And there's a lot of good reasons to think that. If I'm going to flip over to Daniel chapter 9.
Now, Dave, quick to interrupt here. The Antichrist making the covenant, would that, in your mind, would you argue that would mean the land would have to be divided?
That's a question I'm wrestling with, actually. And one of the questions, and that's a little later in the PowerPoint, but I don't mind jumping into that because I wrestle with, does the land have to be divided? I guess we lost Forrest, but we'll continue here. Does the land have to be divided? And I explored that in my own mind, and I'll bounce this off of you guys as we go to the passages that deal with that. And so, one of the biggies is Joel 3 and verse 2. And as we read through it, I will gather all the nations, underlined, and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my heritage Israel, because they have scattered them among the nations and divided up my land. So here's a powerful passage, one of the important ones, the judgment is coming on the nations. And I think this will be more of an Armageddon type judgment. This will be a Psalm 2 type thing, but that passage doesn't necessarily deal with Israel dividing the land in a covenant relationship. And so as I look at that, I go, okay, as you put the pieces of the puzzle together, it's going to fit somewhere, but it doesn't really answer that question. Does Israel have to divide the land in a covenant right now? That passage by itself, but there's a few others we have to look at. So any comments on that, Daniel?
I'm looking very much at the current state of affairs, and I saw the comment made by Saudi Arabia at the United Nations about working towards the quote unquote 2-state solution, which does divide the land. What I found particularly interesting is it's not just Saudi Arabia. It's like Saudi Arabia and 90 other countries or something like that. Right. So I kind of see if that were to happen, that seems like a pretty good indication that there's a group of nations here and they're about to do something really stupid here.
Yeah.
Well,
that's some of where we're going tonight. And, I think trying to follow a PowerPoint's a little hard. And I think we'll just go where the conversation wants to go. But they had, so we have the UN coming to their decision. And the world, 192 nations getting behind the UN. Basically, they're taking global sovereignty. And every country in the world has empowered and said amen to that, not with a direct vote necessarily, but by not pushing back. And so they've quietly behind the scenes slipped into that power mode on September 23rd. Well, one of the things that I was kind of assuming was that this covenant, if we're on to the right covenant, it would happen on Tishri 1 following the Jewish calendar. So flipping back. And so that kind of threw me off just a little bit early on. as I was looking at this, we have 70 weeks and then 69 weeks, Messiah's cut off. And then we have 1 week left. And so we go down to Daniel 9:27, and we have this he that's going to make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. And so now we look at what's happened, and that happened on Tishri on September 23rd, which interestingly, as you look at the Jewish calendar, Tishri 1 and the start of their calendar is going to shift each year. It's not going to be the same date. And there's kind of a window in there where it moves about. And so we're kind of inside that window. But anyhow, that sort of threw me, and that's one of the assumptions. And I began to realize the assumptions I have. And so in talking, with the folks in our group, and we have different viewpoints in there on our Saturday morning. And one of the lessons I'm learning is, what assumptions am I making, and encouraging other people to examine their assumptions that may or may not necessarily be biblical, and to be open to allowing the Lord to change our minds on things as we get more light. And Rick, you and I have talked about that quite a bit. And so that was kind of huge as I had to begin now to rethink, and I think maybe Nelson too, to rethink, well, does this final week mean that it has to start on exactly Tishri 1? So that took a while to work through. And then lo and behold, I've learned since then that they actually did have a meeting on Tishri 1, the International Alliance led by Saudi Arabia, to divide the land. And so, wow, that's getting pretty specific. And so anyhow, as I look at Antichrist makes the covenant, is this true or is it an assumption? And I'm thinking, just because it's an assumption doesn't mean it might not be true. Because I think we all have an ability to sort of paint a picture in our head. And sometimes I think we're going to be right on. But I think we have to keep the proper attitude and recognize I might not be right on. Any thoughts on that, Rick?
Well, there are a lot of indicators, that Ben Salman was, of course, in the middle of that. And there's been a lot of talk about how he fits maybe the bill. And of course, there's the whole question of Islamic Antichrist. And I'd recommend Joel Richardson's book on that, as well as The Jew Rules the World. And that's not talking about a Jewish Antichrist. That's talking about when Jesus will have the millennial reign, where he's ruling and reigning. And those are great kind of foundational studies that can help you to kind of see this possibility. I have a lot of friends that are so stuck in the mode that it's going to be a Western European leader that's going to come out of Rome that's going to, usher this in. And so I think we might be looking at the wrong thing if we're not looking towards more of a Mideast Antichrist. And certainly Ben Salman's a candidate for that, although there are certain things he doesn't even fit. So I like to hold on loosely to these ideas. I say there's things that we can know for sure, and we don't want to trade those things we know for sure for things that we don't know. And as I mentioned in our last discussion, it's like that pillar in the room. You can't move that. That doesn't change. There's certain scriptural things that are like pillars. And then there's other things that are kind of like furniture in the room. And when the lights are out, you're not sure where it is, but you're not going to move the pillars. You might move the furniture. And a lot of these things are going to move and change, but there's certain things I think we can bank on. Certainly the midpoint we know will be, indisputable. And we also, I think we need to be keeping our eye on Israel starting to sacrifice. I think those will be things that will confirm some of our suspicions that we have today.
Yes, Rick, and I have to, on that point about Israel returning to sacrifice, I was thinking about this kind of, meditating on what would it really take to, because Netanyahu's not one who you would think would be one to want to divide the land. And so, Dave, this is kind of something I want to pose to you. Do you think that maybe, and this could be for political reasons, I'm not exactly sure, they would be willing to divide the land if it meant they get 100% access to the holy sites in Jerusalem. They get to build the temple. They get to resume sacrifices. They get to do what a very large growing number of people in Israel want to see happen.
Right. Well, that's the question I think we have to wrestle with. What would it take? And we have the furniture in the room, like Rick is saying. We know there's a midpoint. We know there's going to be a temple, and we know there's going to be sacrifices. It's going to be cut off at the midpoint. Something has to launch this 70th week. We know right now, after Gaza and Hamas and the brutality, Israel is not going to be very quick to say, hey, yeah, let's have another state within here that slaughter us again. And so you have to go, well, what in the world is it going to take? And then as I look at that international committee led by Saudi Arabia, and it's surprising to me a little bit that Saudi Arabia is coming down really hard on Israel, saying, we're going to, back to Daniel 9:27, we're going to force them. And let me pull that back up, Daniel 9:27. And it's a interesting line there. We are going to force them. And we've been looking, all of us have been looking at, he shall make a strong covenant with many. And as you go to the Hebrew, and I was able to talk to a young pastor who is excellent in the Hebrew language to kind of confirm this. But in Daniel 9:27, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Doing a little bit of a deep dive into that word confirm, and it's gabar. And the guys that know Hebrew tell us that it's in the hifil form. And the young pastor I was talking to said, the way this is constructed, there is causation. So we have the covenant, and then somebody's going to force that covenant to be accepted. So, and he shall conform. It's actually very strong forcing. It's beyond really strengthening. It will add strength, but it will force. And so now as you look at the international community that did meet on Tishri 1, and their whole, what they talked about was forcing Israel to divide the land. The European contingent pushed really hard that their contention is they're not going to agree to this. We have to force them. That is sounding so prophetic, and it launches on Tishri 1, which, like, that's pretty amazing. And as I look at that, then I'm like, it looks like it's going to happen. I do believe we have launched into the 70th week. All the pieces of the puzzle are there. So then what's going to cause it? Like you're raising, Daniel. And number one, I don't have a great answer for that other than external pressure is going to be massive. And then I'm thinking Israel's probably, to get to a place of dwelling safety, they've got to deal with Iran and the nukes. And there's a part of me that just thinks, I don't know how they get to the midpoint dwelling securely with a nuke-armed country that says we want to annihilate you. Right. So it seems to me they got to do that. And what will that, if the world, here Israel gets hit by Hamas and just a genocidal slaughter, and it's like, then how does the world react to that? It's Israel's fault. Israel's evil. Israel's responsible for all the evils in the world, and we have demonstrations all over the world. And so, world pressure is amazing.
That's ahead, another.
There's Forrest.
Hey, Forrest. That's another possibility that you have again, to get Israel to agree. Perhaps you have some also, what do they call that? Where you remove your weapons, basically, right? You deconstruct your what's that? Disarmament. Thank you, Rick. Yeah. So maybe remove military, or not military, but nuclear, capabilities, perhaps Israel feels safer that way. So, I mean, that is definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
I was thinking of that.
Rick, do you have any thoughts on that as we ponder
Yeah,
it?
I have some of the same thoughts Daniel does. And again, we'll be able to look at this with 2020 hindsight and see what all happened and came together. But I'm kind of envisioning Israel not necessarily passively being pushed into some type of land division, but rather through their strength, possibly completely wiping out Iran and gaining control over Lebanon and really having supremacy. That they will, on one hand, be able to dwell securely, and I think there's a lot of them that will make that compromise, which I don't recommend. I think it violates God's promise about the land, but they will go ahead and move into that division, as Daniel had mentioned, probably to broker some deal to be able to use the Temple Mount. Right now, that's under Jordanian control. And when I was on the Temple Mount in 2018, the Jews actually don't go up there. The tour guide did, but they, when they do, it creates quite a scene. And so there's going to have to be a significant change in the way Jerusalem is being managed by Israel in order for, at least if the sacrifices are going to take place on the Temple Mount, which I believe they will, rather than someplace like Shiloh or something like that. That would be the only other option.
Rick, did you know that I just heard this, that this year was the first year that they went up, and this would have been over, I believe, Sukkot, and they went up and they didn't do any sacrifices, but they actually did all of the religious ceremonies that they wanted to, and this was the first time there was no like interruptions, there was no protests. I just found that out last month. I was very surprised to see that.
Yeah, the Jordanians are heavily armed, and they don't really allow for any kind of shenanigans up there. So I didn't hear about that, and I'd like to. I guess it wasn't well advertised.
Yeah, I only knew because of people I'd heard from actually in Israel.
Another scripture that deals with a covenant and dividing the land that we have to look at. Joel 3:2 was the nations. Here we get a little closer to home with Israel being a part of it. It says, "Wherefore hear the word of Jehovah." I've got it in the ASV here because it's not all marked up. You scoffers that rule this people that is in Jerusalem, because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we are in agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us, for we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. And studying this passage, number one, I look at verse 14, and who's making this covenant? And it says, those that rule this people. And so as I look at the circumstance on the ground, I mean, here's leaders that are going to make a bad call and make this covenant with death and Sheol, which Revelation 6 and the fourth seal talks about the same death and Sheol riding with the fourth rider. And so I believe it's kind of a passage that is a parallel with Revelation 6 and the fourth seal. And there's a consequence for them making this covenant. And I look at, well, who makes it? Well, the people that rule. And yet, okay, so that gives me a little hint, because I know Israel is very divided, even though they got pretty united so far under Netanyahu with the Gaza situation and then Hezbollah. So right now they're united. They do seem to fragment pretty easily, especially under adversity. They haven't had a lot of adversity so far. How will they respond when the whole world is clamoring for them to divide the land? and the pressure accelerates, and human beings don't respond well to pressure. I know I don't like pressure. I don't always respond the way I would like to. And you can see a contingent in Israel siding with that, because there are strong voices in Israel that would already like to divide the land. They're pretty overruled by the majority of people in Israel because of the slaughter. But human nature being what it is, I can see capitulation possibly happening, especially as the conflict grows with Iran, et cetera. You can see that possibility. And here's where I think about Donald Trump coming in. The one world leader that Israel would trust would be Donald Trump. I don't think they can trust anybody else. The problem with America, though, is we change leaders. And so it's always a bit of a roll of the dice. But he's just got in for 4 years. I can see Israel, maybe the door of pliability opening up a little bit with Trump coming in. And Donald Trump is such a let's make a deal guy. And he'll reverse course pragmatically when needed. I voted for him. He'll push back on a lot of more evil than the Dems would and Kamala Harris. But does he have the ability to take a side that is not a godly side? I think so. He did it with the abortion. He switched sides on that. I mean, he's still way better than let's abort them all the way up to 9 months. You know, he put a time limit on it, but it still I was sad to see that. He sort of shifted on the whole transition thing. And it's like, well, if parents are okay with it, then it should be okay. And with the FISA thing and the shot, he's never really shifted gears on that. So he claims to not be a politician, but he's human, and he does have that potential, and he's a deal maker. And I can see when the globe comes hard against him that he could go that direction and begin to push him, but he would be able to do it. Trump has an ability to work with people and not alienate them. I think he has skill. He's got strong people skill. That could factor in. And I'll stop with that. I'm sure I've raised some thoughts in your minds about this.
Well, I wanted to just kind of be clear here on the stream here for whoever's watching. If you're watching, you may not be that familiar with the United Nations and how they vote and all that, but it is, the current United Nations. It's very, very interesting to see that the U.S. and Israel are on one side of many issues, and the rest of the world is very quickly becoming on the other side of other issues and how they're voting. And it's very interesting to see this. It's like there's this split where it's U.S., Israel versus everyone else. So when we're at that kind of a point, that's where it's like, okay, well, maybe Israel really only has an ally with the U.S. and as we're saying, as Dave's just saying, maybe Donald Trump is really the only guy. It took me a little while to kind of come around to that idea. I'm very much of the mindset that, there could be other world leaders that could make things, not false peace, but like just, could be good for Israel, could do something. But who comes to mind right now? I mean, everyone's pretty much in it for some geoeconomic reason. Maybe there's something there that is helpful. But I mean, Putin's with Iran right now. I get the feeling that China is more or less, they're doing it for political reasons. So maybe they could come around at some point. But they seem to be more on the side of trying to give Palestine their own state as well.
Yeah. And if the deal is made, and I believe it will be, Donald Trump is looking like he is going to be the president. here's a given. I think a deal is going to be made. I think pressure is coming in for whatever reason. It's going to divide the land. And then we are in that first seal. The rider on the white horse has ridden, and we're under massive deception. So I'm always thinking in terms of those big themes that we're under. So we make the deal of the century, and then the repercussions on America as we move that direction. And Donald Trump is in power. So he gets in there January 20th. The first seal flew open October 2nd or 3rd. He's in there January. Now we're about 10 months away or less from the second seal of war. And the stage is already massively set. And we've got, $37 trillion in debt. And I'm like, Romans 1 judgment is ready to fall. And if I think what kicks the dominoes and they start to fall is the dividing of the land of Israel, and Donald Trump will be a major reason for that to happen. And then that will cause a ripple effect, among which I think America, we start to pay a big price. And I would say get your house in order big time right now. Because like you said, Rick, there's furniture in the room, and some of it is fixed and some of it's maneuverable. And the midpoint is fixed. I think Tishri 1 as a starting point. We're in that first week. I think a strong case can be made. I barely touched on it so far. And as I'm excited about the Trump presidency, I'm also like, those dominoes are going to fall, I think. And so here is where having an understanding of prophecy, the sons of Issachar knew how to take action. Well, one of them is prepare yourself, your family, your friends, and start teaching, because the dominoes are getting ready to fall. And that's the massively practical side to understanding world events and where we are. I see it right around the corner. Rick, do you have any thoughts on that?
I've all kinds of ideas flooding in. A little earlier, Daniel was talking about, we're talking about the leaders and the UN. There's a couple things that I think we want to point out is our fellow that I've had the pleasure of getting to meet is Alex Newman. And if you haven't followed him in the Liberty Sentinel, he's done excellent work in terms of following the World Economic Forum, the work that's going on in the United Nations, a lot of the things that are not being reported. And he told me a year ago over dinner, it was in the spring, not a year ago, to really be watching out for this Pact for the Future that just happened. And I think a lot of folks in the church are asleep and don't know about this stuff going on. And so, we talked a little bit, I think, in one of our previous discussions about the 10 virgins. And we often mistakenly think about them as being 5 that were with it, ready to go, and 5 that weren't prepared, when actually all 10 were sleeping when the bridegroom came. And so it's the church, I think, will be completely asleep, is not prepared for this. And the difference is those that are in the Word, those that have the oil of the Holy Spirit, and those that understand the Word's authority are going to be prepared to be able to go through this time, where the others are going to be running around looking for oil and not understanding the circumstances that they found themselves in. And so I think those are some things that come to mind. I also want to mention John Howler. He's been interesting to follow. He had on his last Sunday morning discussion, he had a clip from, of all people, Bill Clinton. I don't know if you saw that or not. And here's a guy, and I think he was in somewhere in Detroit or something, talking to a very large Muslim and Arab population area. And he's saying, look, I understand you're concerned about the Palestinians. I understand your concern about, them having a place to live and the horrors of war and the things they're suffering. But he actually, to my surprise, completely came down on pro-Israel and Israel's complete justification for standing up and doing what they did. So, and the reason I say that is to say that anybody could rise up surprisingly and be that guy. So anybody could rise up they're out of the left and come in and actually maybe broker that deal that we're not even aware of yet that is going to be in our near future.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I pulled up Matthew 25:5 that Rick referred to, and that's actually been a help to me because the reality is the folks that you would love to talk to, very few are very open to examining what we're talking about for a variety of reasons. And Scripture talks about being patient and gentle with all. This passage really is helpful if you understand that prophetically, the Bible says they're going to be asleep. And it certainly is true. And yet at the same time, Nelson Walters had a guest speaker who is PhD candidate with, I think, 12 professors, in biblical studies that were examining him. And as he began to probe into them and shared his thesis, and his thesis was that we've entered into the final week and Mystery Babylon was a global entity. And he didn't go into depth on what Mystery Babylon was all about, but it was a global entity with connections, satanically driven and demonically driven connections globally and economically, that gave him understanding and insight into the UN, which we're talking about right now as part of that globalistic entity and cabal. And he said his examiners, who are preachers, pastors, profs, were very unfamiliar with a lot of scripture that he was trying to share with them. It was new. And they did not spend a lot of time with it. And I think studying prophecy, is kind of in the wheelhouse of Calvary Chapel. It's not in most other churches, so I commend Calvary Chapel for that. But what was a little bit encouraging, he had 3 hours sit down, captive audience, and he made the case. And he said 8 out of the 12 embraced the position that he was arguing, that we've entered the 70th week at that PhD level. And that was encouraging to me. And so Monday morning, I was in a Bible study with about probably 12 folks from Highland Baptist here in Redmond. And when we were all done with the Bible study, it was in James, and there was a number of us kind of hanging around talking. And some of them I spoke with on a number of occasions. And long story short, there was about 4 of those guys that I've had conversations with. And I expressed to them how I thought we were in the 70th week, and they were asking some questions. And I got very little pushback because I made the case. I talked with them on numerous times. They were open. They weren't like, me highly focused on it, but they were like very accepting of the premise that we were in. And I just made a very brief case at that time. And I was pleased to say I did not get a lot of resistance. Mostly people just don't want to have the conversation. And if you have them that want the conversation, I think even though Matthew 25:5 says everybody's going to be asleep, the midnight cry I was getting from that PhD candidate who did pass, they all passed him. His message was the midnight cry can come for people. They can open up. If you have an opportunity, take it. And don't assume, okay, well, the Bible says that everybody's going to be asleep, so why try? I think we continue to use discernment, and when doors open, give it a shot and be patient, be gentle, and give people an opportunity to ponder. Probably they're not going to embrace it right out of the chute. Just like if we have some folks listening to this, we haven't even hardly made the argument, which is fine. We'll get there. This will be an ongoing discussion over a period of time. We haven't really delved into the nuts and bolts of why I think we're in the 70th week. No, I don't want to speak for Rick and Dan. You guys can kind of would say where you're at and maybe even mention what got you there. But it's kind of encouraging. I think Matthew 25:5, number one, be patient. And number two, you can bring people across the line. Any of you guys want to jump on all that?
Well, I think Forrest is about to.
Forrest, are you back?
Yeah, I'm back.
Yes.
That was a technological nightmare.
Did you have a little bit of a nap going on here? Or?
Yeah, I mean, my audio and everything.
Forrest just got off work and joined us.
I'm operating on.
Have you heard much of our conversation, Forrest?
No, I mean, I'm using old technology here. Computers old, phones old. So, yeah.
Let me throw this out. I don't know how long we'll keep going. It's kind of getting late, and I'm hopeful that we can do this on a regular basis. Do you think that we possibly are in the 70th week? And if there's an affirmative on that, we all want confirmation. There would be a temple and sacrifices. I think quite likely a dividing of the land. But maybe just kind of quickly, how many of you have landed there? And you may not even know. You can go, I don't know if we are or not. But whatever your thoughts are on that, anybody want to jump on?
I'll go. I mean, I think that it's quite possible. I'm still waiting for some confirmation. I feel like a dividing in the land would be pretty. I think that would be probably good enough for me to be able to say, okay, I think we're there. And then, of course, if the first seal, we just had the first seal, you'd be also looking for something very, I would say more like a global war, more like a World War III. But it could still be very regional, the second seal with regards to Israel.
So, Daniel, when you look at Gabar, and you've studied this as well, and we see the UN meeting September 23, taking a big power jump, and then we have the International Alliance with Saudi Arabia saying we're going to force Israel. Is that pretty convincing to you that we may well be into it, or is there other things that have convinced you?
Well, I think the Saudi Arabia thing is pretty big. I mean, I think the eclipses. I mean, that wasn't for nothing. I don't think. I was blown away every time they meet to talk about dividing the land between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the U.S. Every time, that's when there was an eclipse over the United States.
That includes October 2nd and 3rd. Everyone was met with an eclipse and followed the next day by a meeting with Mohammed bin Salman. And it's like 4 times in a row, eclipse. And the Bible does talk about God speaking through the heavens to us in Genesis 1. And so we've had quite a bit of discussion. I used to be pretty skeptical, and you can go crazy on stuff like that, of course. But I thought mathematically, what are the probabilities of that happening?
Yeah.
And so, it's definitely worth considerable thought. And so anyhow, kind of giving you a chance to catch up on the conversation, Forrest. Rick, you want to jump in?
Well, I was just hoping to hear from Forrest before we sign off tonight.
We will hear from Forrest. I'm giving him a chance to kind of hear the conversation. Are you ready to jump in, Forrest?
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
I think I still remain undecided on if we're in the final 7 years. And as regards, on a more localized level, within our own nation, one of the concerns I've heard voiced, and I kind of share this concern, is Donald Trump being sort of a Trojan horse. Sort of like bringing like the whole Hegelian dialectic. The left is obviously blatantly evil. And so what's a good way to coax Christians into buying into this, into even more of a surveillance state than to present the problem of the evil left, and then bring in this knight in shining armor to come to our rescue. And and then even looking at somebody like J.D. Vance's background, and his ties to the surveillance state. I mean, just like under Bush with the Patriot Act. I mean, who's to say? I mean, at the beginning of this meeting, I mean, I've missed the bulk of the meeting, but at the beginning of the meeting, somebody, I think Rick, you mentioned increase of the surveillance state. And so, I mean, I know that it sounds like Donald Trump is more hands off, but again, we saw that under Trump, the whole vaccine push came about.
Yeah.
Right, that wasn't under Biden. That was under Trump. Secondly, I mean, looking at how emergencies are used. I mean, namely, in with the pandemic was the last thing, but I mean, now we're hearing more and more about cybersecurity, and even seeing the way things are moving towards that central bank digital currency. If the establishment can put somebody forward like Donald Trump and J.D. Vance to really get the conservative side, and then they come in to back something like central bank digital currency, I know that that's a concern that has been voiced, and it's something that I also share. Because, I mean, in the end, you know, you think about, I mean, Satan masquerades as an angel of light. And I mean, when you think about, and I'm not saying Trump's the Antichrist or anything like that.
Right.
But when you think about, I mean, the left that is just blatantly evil, and you're like, okay, sex changes, gender reassignment surgery for kids, slaughtering preborn human beings. Okay, but then you have somebody like Donald Trump who can take a stand against those things, but then also use him to sort of, you know, implant these strings of, you know, to deepen the state's control of individuals. I mean, you know, everybody's voiced their concerns for what is it, the social credit system, and then compiling everybody's information all into, you know, into one thing. And I mean, I can just see, you know, that being disposed as this great solution to all our problems as far as cybersecurity is concerned on an individual level. I mean, I more and more I'm hearing of cases of fraud, even in my own experience. You know, having had that happen recently, and then people in my own personal life are experiencing that, and like, okay, so now what's the solution?
Yeah. You know, I appreciate all those points that you're raising, and I raised them with a group of men, pretty much the same things. And I was happy to hear, and we had some real strong Trump supporters on the Monday morning group. And they were all saying, yeah, I think about that all the time. I think we definitely want to make sure people are using a lot of discernment in the days ahead. Rick, do you have any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, I sure agree. You know, I think it was Franklin Graham that said, you know, we're not trying to elect our pastor. You know, we are taking the lesser of evils when we elect someone. And so I feel that there's some things that I'm, you know, temporarily excited about if Trump does actually win this thing. Looks like he's going to. But at the same time, I'm concerned because I see many of my Christian brothers and sisters that almost have just the opposite a Trump derangement syndrome. They can have kind of the Trumporia syndrome. And, you know, they kind of see him as the savior, you know, like this is all we need. And Jesus is what we need. And I think we have to elect the best officials we can get. And we have to pick the lesser of evils. But I do think, you know, he could be that Trojan horse that Forrest is talking about. And I'm not even saying that that's in his motives. I think it might be his role that he ends up playing, just being who he is and with the influence that is put upon him, that he'll end up being that Trojan horse that'll usher in a lot of the things that will create the structure that later will not only usher in the Antichrist and bring him to power, but will be the persecution of the saints.
Yeah. I
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Daniel.
Oh,
was that Daniel?
Okay. Yeah, I was. Forrest didn't miss this, but while you were out, one of the points actually Rick brought up, which is I thought was really good. It's the antithesis. It's still very true here that it doesn't really matter which political side you're seeing. I mean, either side could very well be the one to pull off some of these things here, whether we're talking, for better or for worse, right? We're talking about, making some sort of a covenant, a peace treaty, helping Israel or hurting Israel. And yeah, either way, you could see it. I mean, and then what you were saying there, Forrest, earlier, about the what happened under the Trump administration and what we dealt with, and I would say under the last year of Trump and the first year of Biden, neither political side wants to even talk about that. They just want to sweep that all under the rug when they're running their campaign and they're wanting your vote. I've noticed that it's very just let's just forget about that and move on. And to me, that's a little suspicious if you're not going to.
Yeah,
both sides.
Our time we've been at it. You guys have been really awesome, and I hope we can do this on a regular basis. And I anybody who's watching can tell. I think this is going to be an edifying group to get your comments as often as possible. And I hope to do this on a fairly weekly basis. And I think it's been an awesome start. We're still working through bugs here and there, but it's okay. And I think it's been a great discussion. This evening is such a great time to start this thing with the presidential election and to be kind of sharing some thoughts on where things are moving. So it is 9:47, and we were going to go about an hour. We went over a little bit, but John Heller goes over all the time, right? So we can do it. But anyhow, I just want to thank everybody a lot for joining us here, and hopefully you had a good experience, and we'll do it again.